Imagine leaving home on an ordinary afternoon, with plans and dreams in your head, only to be interrupted by someone who, for no reason, sees you as different. Mia Lopez, a talented and determined young woman, experiences this when she is approached by a policeman who judges her only by her appearance. What he doesn't know is that Mia is not alone, and that her strength is far greater than any prejudice. In this impactful story, you'll follow an episode of resistance, dignity, and friendship that makes you wonder, how would we react in her place? Did you like this story? Then subscribe, leave your like, and share in the comments what you would do if you were in Mia's shoes. Hi, my name is Mia Lopez, and you may not know me, but I bet you know someone like me. I'm one of those people who never stops. You know, the type who's always juggling ideas, planning the next step, and figuring out the next thing to learn? Yeah, that's me. My daily life is an intense mix of work and studies. I'm a freelance graphic designer and a university student studying digital design, which means I'm always involved in projects, scribbling ideas, or developing something new. Being a freelancer has its perks and challenges. I love the freedom to choose my projects, to say yes or no depending on whether I feel it'll add something to my journey. But there's also the financial uncertainty, so I have to keep my eyes open for new opportunities. Every contract I close feels like an achievement, a little push that brings me closer to my dreams. One of those dreams is closer than ever. My biggest goal is to open a design studio focused on inclusion and diversity. I want my company to be a space where the work reflects the stories of people who, like me, sometimes feel invisible. The idea is to create projects that are meaningful, that convey respect and authenticity. I know it sounds ambitious, but why not? I think every project I take on now is like a building block toward that vision. This dream is deeply connected to my own story, I think. When I was born, my parents found out that I had a paralysis that would prevent me from walking. I grew up knowing that society still has a lot to learn about inclusion. From a young age, my mother would always say, "You're stronger than you think, Mia." And she was right. I never let my disability define me. But at the same time, I recognize that it's part of who I am. And that's not a problem. In fact, it's a strength. I know it might sound a little cliché, but being a Latina woman with a disability taught me to see the world from a different perspective, and I want that to shine through in my work. There's a project I'm really excited about too. Recently, I was invited by an NGO to develop a digital inclusion campaign. They want me to help create a visual identity that shows how the internet can be a welcoming space for people with disabilities. This invitation made me ecstatic. First, because it aligns perfectly with what I believe in. Second, because it brings me closer to my dream of opening my own studio. I usually share these projects with my friend Lucas. He's always been a big inspiration to me. Lucas is a lawyer and one of the strongest and most sensible people I know. He's faced challenges as a black man in a conservative field, so he understands well what it means to fight for space and respect. He always tells me, "Mia, the struggle is ongoing, but so is growth." And he's right. I feel like I'm on a constant path of learning and evolution. Oh, and one more thing, I'm stubborn. In fact, stubbornness might as well be my middle name. When I decide on something, you can bet I'll do everything possible and impossible to make it happen. People who see me around, calm and focused, might not realize it, but behind this serene image is someone who has faced many prejudiced looks, judgments, and labels that tried to bring me down. Instead of letting it wear me down, it just gave me even more drive to keep moving forward. I think, in a way, that ended up defining who I am. So, when I say I want to have my own studio, I'm not talking about a passing idea. It's a dream I'm already shaping, one I see taking form with every project I finish, every new contact I make. A studio where I can show that, no matter who you are or what challenges you face, you too can make a difference. I want to be an example for others, for those who feel excluded or undervalued, showing them that, yes, it's possible to achieve a lot, even when the world seems to pull you down. When I share these dreams, sometimes I feel that people doubt me. That look of, can she really do it? But you know what? It doesn't discourage me, on the contrary, it strengthens me. If I had listened to every doubt, I would have stopped long ago. Every time someone says I'm thinking too big, it only reminds me why I started. Whenever I can, I try to inspire others to do the same, to not bow their heads to challenges. It's my way of giving back the support I received in life. I know it sounds like a rather serious conversation for an introduction, but I hope you understand me. I want you to know that I'm driven by this pursuit of authenticity, not just for myself, but for everyone who faces challenges like mine. And for me, design is a way to show that the world can be a more welcoming and fair place. After all, design can be more than just beauty. It can tell stories, break down barriers, and unite people. And that is my greater purpose. So, when someone asks me what I want to do with my life, the answer is simple. I want my art and my work to speak louder than any label. I want every piece, every logo, and every color I choose to show that there's room for everyone. That every detail, every line is a form of resistance and a way to demonstrate that diversity is something to be celebrated. That afternoon had a different vibe, as if the entire city had tuned into the same expectation I felt. I had just left the meeting with the NGO team and was still trying to process everything. You know that feeling when things start to go right and you're left with a mix of excitement and nervousness, wondering what might come next? That's exactly how I felt. The meeting was much better than I expected. They were so open to the ideas I brought. The NGO team wanted an impactful visual campaign, something that showed that everyone, regardless of any condition, deserves an inclusive space. This was my chance to turn everything I believed in into something concrete, visible. And more than that, it was my opportunity to prove myself as a designer. After leaving the NGO headquarters, I needed a moment to organize my thoughts and put everything on paper, so I decided to stop at the Central Square. This was one of my favorite places in the city. Whenever I needed inspiration, that's where I would go. That afternoon, the sun was starting to set, spreading a golden light that made everything more beautiful. The trees around created a soft shade, and the sound of children playing in the background felt like the perfect soundtrack for that moment. I took a deep breath and placed my folder of papers on my lap, organizing my meeting notes. I opened my notebook and started sketching out some ideas right away. My mind was already racing, thinking of tones that conveyed warmth, the right icons to represent diversity, and fonts that were modern yet accessible. This project could be the beginning of something big. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Lucas asking where I was. I replied that I was at the Central Square, and he said he was on his way. Lucas had always been my anchor, the person who could make me laugh and remind me to breathe when everything felt too fast. Today, I wanted to tell him all the details of the meeting, share this joy, and maybe seek some advice too. He was my anchor, and he knew how to listen better than anyone else. As I waited, I looked around and observed the movement around me. In front of me, a child was chasing a small, scruffy dog, both of them laughing. Yes, I swear the dog was laughing too. On the other side, an elderly couple was embracing on a bench, smiling as they watched the ebb and flow of people. The city had these magical moments, and I loved being part of it, even if just for brief instants. For a moment, I allowed myself to dream a little. I imagined what it would be like to open my own studio and have projects like that digital inclusion one as the flagship. Maybe one day I'd have my own team, made up of people from different backgrounds, each bringing their own perspective. My studio would be an open space where diversity was a principle and empathy the main language. That was my dream. And now, I was starting to take the first steps to make it a reality. I felt a gentle breeze and closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the peace. It was rare for me to have this kind of calm, this breath amid the rush of deadlines and school. In that moment, everything seemed to be in place. I was on the right path, and this was just the beginning. Shortly after, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Are you daydreaming again, Mia?" Lucas joked, pulling me out of my trance. I turned and smiled. He was there with that calm smile and relaxed posture I always knew. Lucas was tall, with a calm and confident presence, and carried a bag full of papers and books, making him look like a mix of lawyer and student, which in fact he was. He sat down beside me, and before I could start sharing about the meeting, he was already looking at me with that curious gaze. "So, how was the meeting?" Lucas asked, knowing I could barely contain my smile. "Lucas, it was amazing. They loved the campaign proposal. I want to create something that truly inspires people, that shows that inclusion is more than just a pretty word," I began, feeling the words spill out without a filter. "I want every detail to show respect and warmth. This is my moment, Lucas. I feel that this project could be the starting point for everything I've always dreamed of." He smiled and nodded, giving me that look of approval only he could give. "I always said you'd go far, Mia. You have this ability to see the best in people and turn that into art. It's going to be a success, I'm sure of it." His words comforted me. Lucas always knew exactly what to say to give me strength, and in that moment, everything felt more possible. You know, sometimes all we need is someone to remind us of what we're capable of achieving. I felt that, with his support and my own determination, no obstacle the world could throw at me would deter me. I would be ready. And it was while I was thinking about this that I noticed a figure approaching out of the corner of my eye. A police officer walking slowly in our direction, watching every movement with an intense gaze. I didn't know it then, but that would be the moment when everything changed. I was still smiling, absorbed in the plans I was discussing with Lucas, when I saw the police officer getting closer. He was a robust man, standing rigidly, moving slowly and observing everything around him with a watchful, almost predatory gaze. The tight uniform accentuated his muscular physique, and his hand rested subtly yet imposingly on the holster at his belt. There was something in his eyes, a cold, judgmental seriousness, as if he were there to enforce an invisible order, and suddenly I felt out of place. He stopped right in front of me and shot a quick glance at me and then at Lucas before fixing his gaze on me. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a direct tone, which carried less curiosity and more explicit suspicion. I swallowed hard, trying to understand the reason for that approach. I looked at Lucas, who frowned and raised an eyebrow slightly, also bewildered by the hostility. I took a deep breath and forced a polite smile. "I am just here in the square organizing some notes. I had a meeting and decided to take a break, relax a little," I replied, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. However, the smile quickly faded, as it was evident he was not satisfied with my answer. The officer, whom I later learned was named Thompson, crossed his arms and looked me up and down with a heavy, almost intimidating gaze. It was a look that seemed to have already judged and condemned me all at once. "A meeting, is it? What kind of meeting were you having here exactly?" he retorted, his voice cold and laden with skepticism. I felt my chest tighten at that question. It was just an ordinary afternoon in a public square. I had the right to be there as much as anyone else. But something in that rigid gaze and the way he tilted his head slightly made me realize that, in his eyes, I didn't belong there. As if being there, in that moment, was suspicious simply because I existed in this way. Lucas, beside me, also sensed the veiled hostility. He shifted, almost wanting to intervene, but hesitated, leaving me to respond for myself. "Yes, a professional meeting," I repeated, trying to control the discomfort that was rising within me. "I work as a graphic designer and it was a meeting with an NGO." My voice sounded firm, but at the same time, I felt a hint of frustration bubbling up. I was there fulfilling my role, trying to pursue my projects, and yet it seemed he wanted an even bigger reason, an extra justification. Thompson let out a dry laugh as if I had told a joke. "A meeting with an NGO?" he repeated as if he wanted to chew on each word. He looked around, gesturing to the park in a tone almost mocking. "This is the best place you found for a meeting, huh?" The question sounded almost like an accusation. It was a comment filled with subtle irony that disarmed me. But there was nothing wrong with the situation. I knew that, Lucas knew that. Even so, I began to wonder what it was about me that bothered him so much. Was it my disability? Or perhaps my wheelchair? I felt a mix of surprise and disbelief wash over me, as in a split second, I realized I was facing a police officer who, without any apparent reason, seemed determined to find something suspicious in me. Still, I maintained my composure. "Sir, I'm just waiting for my friend here," I explained calmly, gesturing to Lucas beside me. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Thompson looked at Lucas for a moment and then turned back to me, with that freezing gaze that made my stomach churn. Lucas crossed his arms and stared back at him in silence, but with a serious expression, as if he were studying every movement of the officer. "Your friend?" he murmured, observing Lucas and seeming to evaluate something. "And what exactly are you doing here with this meeting?" His words hit my chest, loaded with a weight I couldn't understand. "I hadn't done anything," I was just there enjoying my moment. Still, that rigid look made me feel small, as if I needed permission to be there. And then it hit me. That was a question he likely wouldn't ask anyone else sitting in the square without any reason. I looked at Lucas one more time, hoping he would catch my expression. It was the same look I had exchanged with him in other situations, a silent plea for help. He always knew what to do. He always managed to understand without me needing to say a word. "Listen, she's not doing anything wrong, right?" Lucas finally spoke in a controlled but firm tone. "We're just here like anyone else, enjoying the late afternoon." There was a brief moment of silence. Thompson looked at Lucas and then at me, seeming to consider whether to respond or to insist on his approach. For a second I felt like he might just walk away, but instead he remained there, imposing, waiting for something. Something neither Lucas nor I knew how to answer. That lingering tension hung between us. I wondered what else he wanted to hear. The heavy silence in the air began to be broken by Thompson's words, who finally leaned a little closer to me. His eyes were fixed on me, but his gaze was not one of simple curiosity. It was a hard look, full of judgment. "You think you can just hang around here out of nowhere as if this were normal, huh?" he said, casting a glance at my wheelchair before turning to Lucas and then back to me. "People like her." He practically whispered the words, but it was enough for both Lucas and me to hear clearly. That phrase echoed in my mind almost like a sentence. I felt my face flush. I didn't know if it was out of shame, anger, or disbelief. A whirlwind of emotions surged through me. Apparently, to him, I was not someone who fit there, someone who belonged in that space. The central square, with its trees and benches, the light energy I had always felt there, suddenly seemed like a strange, heavy place, as if in Thompson's view, I had no right to be sitting on that bench, waiting for my friend and organizing my work. I took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of indignation threatening to erupt. I looked at Lucas, and he returned my gaze firmly, as if he were ready to intervene at any moment, but I knew I needed to handle this in my own way. "With all due respect, Officer Thompson," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, even with my heart racing. "I don't know why you're saying this. We're just here, sitting and talking like anyone else in this square." Thompson looked at me for a moment, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something that seemed like hesitation in his eyes. But soon that shadow disappeared, replaced by a rigid expression, almost one of contempt. "You think I don't see this all the time?" he retorted, crossing his arms again. "Young people like you, pretending you're just here for a stroll but with no real purpose. Especially someone like you." He pointed at my wheelchair with a dismissive gesture, as if it were a common thing. As if someone, like you, really had something important to do here. I swallowed hard, feeling the impact of his words. This was far beyond a question about what I was doing there. Thompson was diminishing me, stripping away the importance of my presence, as if the mere fact that I existed outside of his expectations was an affront. Lucas shifted beside me, stepping forward. "Look here, this has nothing to do with you, Thompson. We're just enjoying the square like everyone else," he said, with a dangerous calm, as if he were choosing each word carefully to avoid losing control. I raised my hand towards Lucas, trying to signal that I was okay and that I wanted to continue the conversation myself. Thompson had gone too far, but I didn't want this to turn into a violent confrontation. I just wanted him to see me, to understand that I had the same right to be there as anyone else. "Officer Thompson," I began, trying to make my voice sound firm and resolute, even though my heart was racing. "You can think whatever you want about me, about what I should be doing or not. But the fact is, I have my goals, my own life, and the right to be wherever I want, without needing to prove anything to anyone." I knew my tone had changed, perhaps more assertive than I was used to being. But something inside me insisted that I needed to respond with dignity and calm. Thompson took a step back, as if my firm tone had unsettled him. "Ah, of course, now you think you have the right to lecture me?" he scoffed with a sarcastic smile. "People like you don't fool me. A wheelchair doesn't give you the right to think the world revolves around you." Each of his words hit me like a blow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. People like you? He saw me only as a wheelchair, as if the fact that I had a disability was all that defined me. As if my work, my dreams, and even that peaceful moment in the square were insignificant. I felt my entire body tremble, not out of fear but out of a mix of indignation and sadness. I took a deep breath again, trying to find the strength to respond. I looked at him with all the dignity I could muster at that moment. "Officer, with all due respect, you don't know me. I'm a person like anyone else, with plans, with goals, and with the right to exist anywhere I want. It's not a wheelchair that defines who I am. And it's definitely not you who will tell me where I belong or not." There was a brief silence after I spoke, as if those words had finally pierced Thompson's armor. For a moment, he seemed to lose control of that hard and unyielding expression. I didn't expect him to back down or change his attitude. I knew his convictions were rooted in something that went far beyond what I could change right then and there. Lucas, beside me, placed his hand on my shoulder as a sign of silent support. I wasn't alone in this, and in that moment, I realized that I had faced Thompson not only for myself but for all the times I had been silenced or ignored. And then, something unexpected happened. I felt the weight of Lucas's hand on my shoulder, an anchor helping me maintain my emotional balance. But the tension around us was like a magnetic field. Thompson was staring at me, his gaze fixed and cold, as if I had committed some unacceptable offense by standing up for myself. He leaned forward, invading my personal space even more, and I felt a sudden chill in my stomach. "So now you think you have the right to give me a moral lesson, huh?" he said, his voice sounding increasingly harsh. "Tell me something. Do you really think you can dictate where I can or cannot be?" His authoritative tone had a strength that made my heart race, each word laden with an anger I could barely comprehend. He looked at me as if I were a problem he needed to solve. His presence was becoming threatening, and the way he positioned himself dominantly, almost cornering me against my wheelchair, sent a shiver down my spine. "Officer, I'm not trying to give a moral lesson to anyone," I said, trying to control the trembling in my voice. "I'm just defending my right to be here, to enjoy the same space as anyone else." Lucas, beside me, stepped closer to me as if he was ready to intervene, but Thompson raised a hand, almost as a warning, and looked at him with a hard gaze. Then he turned his attention back to me and, in a sudden movement, placed both hands on the armrests of my wheelchair. He didn't push me, but his presence there, so close and with that hostile expression, was suffocating. I felt my body instinctively shrink away, and a warmth rushed to my face. It was as if all the strength and dignity I was trying to maintain dissipated under his pressure. "I don't have time to deal with people who think they can do whatever they want," he said in an almost whispered tone, but with a roughness that echoed around us. It was at that moment that everything began to spiral out of control. He gripped the armrests of the chair tightly, and for a moment, I thought he might actually push me away as if I were just a bothersome obstacle. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming, and a knot formed in my chest. I had never felt so powerless. "Officer, this has crossed the line," Lucas said finally, his voice firm and clear. He stepped forward, standing by my side and shielding me with his body. Thompson let out a dry laugh and shook his head, as if faced with something he considered pathetic. It seemed he didn't even see Lucas as a threat, but rather as an annoying interruption. "Do you really think you can tell me what I can or cannot do?" he said, still with his hands firmly on the armrests of my chair. The pressure on the sides was uncomfortable, and his proximity left me breathless. For a moment I felt time stand still, and I realized how much this went beyond an issue of authority. It was abuse, an attempt to silence me, to show me that I had no voice, that my presence there was a mistake. I looked directly into Thompson's eyes, struggling not to let fear show, but I felt every second of that confrontation weighing on my shoulders. And beside me, Lucas didn't back down. "Get your hands off her now," he ordered, his voice serious, with a determination I had never heard before. His voice seemed to awaken something in the officer, who finally pulled his hands away from my chair, but not before taking another step closer to Lucas, as if he were challenging him. They stared at each other for a long second, and the air felt thick, electrified by the tension. In that moment, I realized how out of control the situation had become. I just wanted to be there, in the square, working on my plans and enjoying my friend's company, but now I found myself in the middle of a confrontation, filled with tension. I looked at Thompson, hoping he would back down, but the anger in his eyes showed that he was far from giving up. For a second, silence returned, but it was a threatening silence, almost like a pause before a storm. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the strength to stay calm. Thompson was still close, but now that he had stepped back a little from my chair, I felt it might be time for me to take the lead. I looked at him firmly, ignoring the cold feeling in my hands and the slight tremble that insisted on making its presence known. "Officer Thompson, I didn't come here to cause trouble," I began, struggling to keep my voice steady. "And I certainly didn't come to challenge your authority. But I have the right to be here just like anyone else, and I want you to respect that." I knew my voice wasn't completely steady. The nervousness was evident, and controlling the tremor in my hands required more strength than I had imagined. But it wasn't just about confronting the officer. It was an exercise in self-control, an internal struggle to maintain my dignity and whatever calm remained in that tense moment. Thompson scoffed disdainfully, crossing his arms as if faced with an absurd scene. "It's funny," he murmured, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "Do you really think that just because you say those pretty words, I'm going to believe you're a normal person? That you can sit here and think you're safe just because you want to?" My hands trembled even more, and I clenched them against the arms of the chair, trying to mask the vulnerability that Thompson insisted on exploiting. It felt like each of his phrases was breaking me down a little more inside. However, I knew I needed to keep going. I felt a slight pressure on my shoulder, and I knew it was Lucas, right beside me, silently offering support. That gave me strength. "I don't need your permission to be here," I shot back, keeping my gaze fixed on him. "But I expected you to treat me with at least a modicum of respect. Because, frankly, it doesn't matter how I look or how I got here. I am a person with my rights, and nothing you say will change that." I spoke slowly, measuring each word, trying to make my tone sound as firm as possible. Inside, my heart was racing. I knew that self-control was keeping me upright, or, in this case, steady in my chair. The effort to not show fear was exhausting, but giving in to the tension was a luxury I couldn't afford. Thompson was silent for a second. There was a mix of anger and surprise in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to someone responding to him that way, especially someone he viewed as inferior. He opened his mouth to reply, but hesitated for a moment, as if something I said had finally pierced through his layer of arrogance and disdain. In that instant, Lucas intervened, his voice low but determined. "Mia has already explained, officer. We will no longer respond to unfounded accusations. If you have a legitimate reason for this approach, then please explain it to us. But we will not accept being disrespected like this." Thompson's expression darkened, clearly irritated by Lucas's stance, but there was a silence around us that seemed to heighten the tension. Other people in the square glanced over, some curious, others looking uncomfortable with the confrontation they were witnessing. I felt a brief moment of triumph seeing Thompson starting to realize that his authority might not be enough to intimidate. He might be a police officer, but I had my dignity, and the strength that Lucas conveyed to me further reinforced my decision not to bow to injustice. My voice grew firmer, the fear slowly giving way to determination. "I'm here for a purpose," I said, looking directly at him. "And that won't change just because you think I don't belong in this place." Thompson's gaze wavered, as if for a second his armor of authority had cracked. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed stuck. It was strange to see him like this, silent and without his usual rigidity, and I realized that, in that moment, he was conflicted. His right hand, which had previously rested firmly on his belt, slid discreetly to the side, as if he had realized he was imposing too much. I'm just doing my job," he murmured, looking away from me and Lucas, the tone of his voice carrying a hint of justification that didn't sound convincing even to himself. "I don't want any trouble here. I just need to make sure everyone is safe." That phrase felt like an excuse he repeated automatically, but the way he said it, with a slight hesitation, made it clear that he knew he had gone too far. I noticed a slight flush in his cheeks and a discomfort I hadn't expected to see in him. It was as if the mask of superiority was slipping, revealing someone who, despite everything, didn't know how to handle a situation where his power was being so openly questioned. I watched him, and in that moment, a whirlwind of emotions swept over me. Seeing Thompson there, at a loss for words, trying to justify his hostile posture, brought me a mix of relief and an unexpected reflection. I felt he wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he clearly judged to be in an inferior position. In his mind, his uniform should be enough to impose respect and obedience. And now, in the face of Lucas's firmness and my own resistance, he seemed lost. "Officer Thompson," I began, my voice calmer, trying to defuse the environment he had created, "I understand that you have responsibilities. But in this case your approach was unnecessary and invasive. I am here peacefully, just minding my own business. Lucas and I pose no threat, and we expect the same respect any person deserves." Those words seemed to hit him differently, and I saw his expression soften, even if just a little. He looked at me, and for the first time, it wasn't with disdain or judgment, but with a kind of uncomfortable understanding. Perhaps he was beginning to realize how unfair and inappropriate his actions had been. Lucas, by my side, crossed his arms, still offering silent support. Thompson, facing the determined calm that both Lucas and I displayed, finally seemed to understand that the conflict had no reason to continue. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a defeat he didn't quite know how to process. He started, but interrupted himself as if searching for the right words. "Well, maybe it was a mistake, this approach." His voice was lower, and I could see that this admission, though small, was difficult for him. Thompson took a deep breath, adjusted his uniform, and for the first time he seemed to feel human, stripped of the cold authority he had previously used as a shield. Suddenly, he was no longer Officer Thompson. He was just a man, insecure, perhaps even regretful, in the midst of a situation that had gone awry. Lucas, seizing the moment, spoke calmly. "We understand, officer. We're all just trying to live peacefully here. I hope this serves as a reflection for you, because our presence in any space is just as valid as anyone else's." Thompson nodded, though visibly uncomfortable. It wasn't easy for him to hear this, but he seemed to know there was no longer any way to contest it. He finally stepped back, taking a few steps away and leaving the space he had so forcefully invaded. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs more lightly, as if I could finally relax. Seeing that man, once so confident in his power, now disarmed by words and dignity, was a silent victory. I knew I hadn't changed his worldview completely, but I had made him reflect, if only for a brief moment. As he walked away, I watched him with a gaze no longer filled with fear or anger, but with understanding. Thompson was someone who perhaps had never learned to see differences with respect, someone who used authority to mask insecurities that now, without his shield, were so apparent. He cast one last look at me and Lucas, devoid of the hostility from before. A brief, almost imperceptible nod was his only gesture before he turned and headed towards another part of the square, probably in search of a situation where he could reaffirm his posture of authority without resistance. I felt a relief wash over me gradually, along with a calm that seemed to restore everything that the encounter had tried to take from me. We sat on a nearby bench, away from where the incident had happened. Lucas let out a long sigh and leaned back against the bench, turning to me with an expression that mixed understanding and indignation. I was still processing everything. The adrenaline still made my breathing a bit quicker than normal, but looking at him helped lighten my burden. "You were amazing, Mia," he said, breaking the silence with a warm tone that made my shoulders relax a little. "I know it shouldn't have happened, but you faced that with so much dignity." I nodded, trying to absorb his words. It was hard. As relieved as I was, I also felt frustration eating away at me, a mix of indignation and sadness. Why did I still have to go through situations like this? "Thank you, Lou. But, honestly, I'm exhausted from all of this," I confessed, looking at the trees around us, trying to find some peace there. "It's tiring to always have to prove that I have the right to be where I am. It's like it's never enough." Lucas watched me in silence for a moment, then placed his hand over mine, offering the silent support I so desperately needed. He knew there were things that words couldn't resolve, but his presence was like an invisible hug, strengthening me even without needing to say anything. I took my phone out of my pocket, still hesitant, but I knew I needed to share what had happened. Not to relive the moment, but so that others would know that even in such situations, there are ways to resist without losing dignity. I took a deep breath and opened the social media app. I typed slowly, choosing each word carefully, and posted the following. Today I went through one of those moments we never expect, but unfortunately, it's not new for many people. Sitting in a public space, I was approached by someone who thought my place wasn't here. Not for a real reason, but because of a series of judgments that don't represent me. I had to remind myself that I belong wherever I am. That my presence is valid, and that no authority or prejudice can diminish me. Here's my gratitude to all those who, like me, do not bow their heads, and also to my friend who stood by me in this difficult moment. Standing firm is our way of resistance. I sent the post and fell silent, feeling the mix of vulnerability and strength that the words brought. Lucas looked at me, and I noticed that he had read over my shoulder, a small smile forming on his lips. This is going to inspire a lot of people, Mia, he said confidently, giving my shoulder a light pat. You're not alone in this, and there are more people than you think rooting for you. Minutes passed, and I began receiving notifications of likes, supportive comments, and private messages from friends and even some longtime acquaintances. Many thanked me for sharing my experience, saying that my courage inspired them to be firmer in similar situations. Others shared personal stories, venting about similar incidents and expressing the same frustration. Reading those messages was like a balm. I wasn't alone, and knowing that my experience resonated with others gave me a sense of belonging. The words of support and the affection coming from people I didn't even know made me feel that, somehow, this situation had transformed into a form of unity. Lucas, still by my side, chuckled softly as he saw my face light up with the supportive messages. It seems people really understand what you went through. I don't think you have any idea of the impact you have, Mia. I smiled, shaking my head. I don't think I'll ever fully understand. But I'm glad to see so many people willing to face this together. I put my phone away, feeling the weight of the experience transform into something different, a renewed strength. That moment of online sharing, of support and acceptance, became an invisible thread connecting me to others who, like me, faced small daily challenges. I looked around and finally felt at peace in my rightful place, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Everything that had happened that afternoon still resonated within me, but in a different way now. It was no longer an open wound but a reminder of strength, mine and that of so many others who confront the same barriers every day. I took a deep breath, and this time I didn't think just about myself. I thought about everyone who, like me, had been judged for their appearance, for where they were, or for any detail that others unfairly judged. By sharing my story, I realized I had become part of something bigger. It was as if every word I had written had echoed, reaching not only the people around me but even those I would never meet. I want to say something to those listening to my story right now. With an open heart, I said, imagining myself in front of everyone who was following me. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, or how others see you. What matters is the pride you have in yourself. No situation, no matter how difficult, can define your worth. With each word, I felt conviction grow within me. I was transported back to every experience I had lived, every time I had been questioned or tried to be intimidated just for being present. Each of those situations, no matter how painful, had made me stronger. And now I wanted that strength to spread, to reach anyone listening, bringing courage to resist. Resisting is much more than an act of bravery, I continued, my tone sincere and direct. It's a daily choice, a commitment we make to our own dignity. We all have the right to be here, to occupy any space, to live without having to justify ourselves. As I spoke, I realized that those words were more than just a message. They were a silent scream, something I wanted to echo in the heart of everyone who had ever felt invisible, small, or out of place. It was my way of reminding everyone, and myself, that our worth is not defined by what others think. I want you to never stay silent in the face of prejudice. I know that sometimes it's scary and that the weight is heavy. But by resisting, you show the world that your presence matters, that you matter. And if at any moment you feel alone or weak, remember, there are many people here, fighting and resisting alongside you. Those words were not just a closing statement but a commitment. A commitment to continue occupying the spaces that were rightfully mine, to not let anyone's prejudice dictate where I could or couldn't be. That afternoon had started with a simple dream of working in peace, but now it had transformed into something much bigger.